Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra Daf Kuf Lamed Daled. I'll just make a brief announcement before class, which is I'll remind everyone that registration is open for Rabbanit Michelle Farber's class, which is starting next week. It's the third in the series of the basics, getting to the basics of what you need to know to learn Gemara. A lot of what Rabbanit Michelle is going to deal with this time is the logic of the Gemara, how exactly it works. So definitely a recommended class. If you haven't learned the first two, you can still do the third. You can also go back and learn them. They're all digital. They sit on our site and you can, everything is free of charge. So highly recommended material. Rabbanit Michelle is a fabulous educator. So that's starting on Sunday. It's the next 3 Sundays. Okay. We're going to get started now with our story. We had a story at the bottom of yesterday's daf. Let's just review what we did from the Mishnah. We have question of whether you're allowed to pass over your children and give their nachalat to somebody else. Okay, if you haven't listened to Geffen yet, you should definitely listen to try to understand both, see two different understandings of the story, which I'm not going to get into in class, only one of them. And the second, which is really interesting, this idea of why is it so obvious that the children are supposed to get the nachalah, and why is it a bad thing according to the Mishnah? Why do they think it's bad that person who doesn't give their inheritance to their children, why is that considered a bad thing? From what perspective? Is it a moral thing? Is it a halachic thing? Is it a legal thing? So there's different approaches among the rabbis to understand this. Now we have someone, basically, it's effective if you want to pass your nachalah to someone else, again, assuming you do it in the right way, gift, all that we've been talking about. But the rabbis aren't pleased with you. However, comes Rosh Bag and says, well, it really depends on whether your children are behaving appropriately, which, however that means, right? It seems to be something about their relationship with God, and is problematic. Or perhaps according to the different version that we saw, maybe it has nothing to do with relationship with God. It only has to do with relationship with the Father. And then it would be, right? So there's two different explanations of what Rosh Bag says. And then the question was, do the rabbis disagree or not? And in the end, we proved that the rabbis disagree. And that was from a Braita. Now we're going to talk about this story. So we'll start again from the beginning. When Shuli Mishkan's flashback came up, was posted about Yonatan ben Uziel, who is an interesting character in and of itself. It was actually funny. I said yesterday that he has a commentary on the Torah and the Nevi'im, and then I said, oh, I think not on the Torah. I couldn't remember. And now when I looked at Shuli's article, she wrote in there that there's the Targum Yerushalmi on the Torah, and some people claim that it was accidentally called the Yerushalmi. It was Taf Yud, Targum Yonatan, and by accident they wrote it was Targum Yerushalmi, and it's attributed to Yonatan ben Uziel. So there goes my deliberation. Okay, now we're going to talk about the story. So if you want to learn more about Yonatan ben Uziel, you should definitely read her article. It's very interesting, and she also compares a whole different version of the story in the Yerushalmi. So somebody wanted to write his sons out of his will because they weren't behaving appropriately. So what does he do? He gives it to Yonatan ben Uziel. Maybe by the end of today, when we talk about who Yonatan ben Uziel, you'll understand why, of all people, he chose Yonatan ben Uziel. Ma asa Yonatan ben Uziel. So what did Yonatan ben Uziel do? Well, he said, Machar shlish, ikdish shlish, v'echzir lebanav shlish. He didn't think it was so great that he wrote his sons out of the will. So a third of it he returned to the sons. Why didn't he return the whole thing? Is a good question. But he decides, I'll keep a third for myself. A third I'll give to the temple, donation. And the other third I'm going to give back to the sons. Ba'alav Shamai b'maklo v'tarmilo. Actually a good note in the Quran that gives all sorts of reasons about why with his makel and termil and what's it representative of, but I don't want to get into that in our daf today. Anyway, he comes with his staff and his cloak, and he says, seeming to stand up against him with a strong tone and say, this is no good what you did. And basically what he wants to do is he wants to take the money out of the sons, get the third back and give it back to Yonatan ben Uziel, or really even more so, give it back not to Yonatan ben Uziel, but take it away, confiscate it, because he says this person gave you a gift on condition, basically the whole condition, and it was obvious he doesn't want his sons to get it, and because he doesn't want his sons to get it, well, because of that, he gave it to you, and you are doing the exact opposite by giving it back to the children. So now we say the following. Amarle, Yonatan ben Uziel has a retort, and he says the following. You want to claim that I'm going against the Tanai, right? I'm going against the stipulation, and therefore, the whole gift is invalid. Well, if that's and then, well, the part I gave to the sons was invalid, and I don't even deserve to get that money. Like you're basically saying the matana is canceled. Part of it is canceled. Well, if you want to take away the money from the children and say this was all done incorrectly, well, then you're basically saying that the father gave me money on condition. I didn't fulfill the condition. The money's not mine. If the money's not mine, well, then go take back the money from the temple and go take back the money to the person I sold it to. And even lav, if you don't, which obviously you don't, because you're not trying to take the money away from the temple. You're not trying to take away the money from who I bought it from, who I sold it to. It's all or nothing. And the Rashbam says it in the words of Ein matana lechatzaim. There's no such thing as a half a gift. Okay, you don't give a gift in part. You don't say if the gift is what he was trying to say, Shamai, is this guy gave it to you on with a stipulation. You didn't keep the stipulation, so it's not yours to do what you want with it. So basically, we're taking back the money, we're confiscating it. But then there's no such thing as a partial gift. The money was given all in one lump sum, one action. So if that money was given in one action, and you want to say that I didn't do the right thing with the money, then you have to take back all the money. Now, I see what you're writing in the chat. Of course, you can't take it back from Hekdesh. It's not possible, right? I mean, it is possible if the person never owned it. And that's really what he's saying. You think I didn't own this money ever? Well, if you think I didn't own this money ever, then take it back from everywhere else. And I know you're not going to do that. So basically, I'm right. And in fact, Amal, Hitiach alai ben Uziel, Hitiach alai ben Uziel. So it's like, Nitzchuni banai. He says, you're right. Now, we're going to see soon. Remember, who's Shamai? Shamai and Hillel, right? The famous Zug. We had a different Zug yesterday of Yossi ben Yoezer. Now we have Hillel and Shamai. We don't have Hillel yet. We'll get to him. We're going to see that Yonatan ben Uziel was the best of all of Hillel's students. And Shammai basically says here, you got me. And just remember, he's a generation below him, really, because he's in the student generation. He says, wow, my student, you're very smart. I don't know if he was Shammai's student also, but he was definitely Hillel's student. Now, the question is, Mikara my savar. What did Shammai think in the first place? So they answer, Mishum ma'aseh de Beit Choron. It's based on this ma'aseh that happened in Beit Choron, which we learned already in Masechet Nedarim. You might remember it, because stories sometimes stick out in our heads, even if we don't remember other things. So let's hear the story, and then we have to figure out, and it's not so clear from the Gemara, what exactly Shammai thought from this story and what the response of Yonatan ben Uziel was and why it wasn't a fair comparison. I just want to point out, I mentioned this yesterday, and I think maybe I even mentioned the beginning of class, but in Gefet this week, the Shiur is both talking about why the son should get the Nachala and talking about the second story and two different versions of the story. I'm going with the Rashbam, and again, as usual, things are always complicated when there's two different versions because it means that one version isn't perfect, and that's why there's a second version. So, a second understanding. So the Tosfot has a totally different understanding of the story, but we're reading it like the Rashbam. If you want to hear a whole different version, you can listen to Gefet. So now it says in a Mishnah, it's a Mishnah in Nidarim, Maaseh bebeit Choron, this case happened in Beit Choron, it was a person who vowed that his father wasn't going to benefit from him. Okay, they got into a fight, I guess, and the son said, I vow you'll never benefit from me at all. What happened? This son was marrying off his own son and wanted to invite the grandfather to the wedding, right? His own father to his son's wedding. So what did he do? He couldn't invite him because the meal was owned by the person, and the father can't benefit from eating the meal, and the land, because he was doing it in his house. So he goes to a friend and he says, listen, I'm going to give you as a gift my courtyard and my meal. But just to make sure you don't think that it's really yours, he adds the following words. They're not before you, Ella, only, I'm only giving it to you so that my father can come and eat with us. Amarlo, so the friend says, if they're really mine, then I'm consecrating them to God. Okay? Basically, he didn't like this arrangement. And he said, I don't want to be party to your you're overriding your vow, and you're not keeping to your vow. And thanks, but no thanks. If you really want to give it to me, well, I'll sanctify it to the heavens. This is kind of like when you do I always think about this, mechirat chametz, right? You sell your chametz. You're not really selling it. It's like a fictitious sale. You're selling it. It's not totally fictitious. You're selling it, but you don't really want this Gentile that you sold it to come into your house and take your food, right? You'd be very upset if they did. That's not really what you sold it for. So, but yet, theoretically, they can, right? So that's what he's saying here. Oh, you're really selling it to me? Great. If you really want it to be a sale, I'm going to consecrate it to the heavens. Amarlo, so to which the person says, this son, lo natata liet shelcha. Oh, sorry. This is the continuation of what this person said. Okay. He said, if you're going to give it to me, I'm going to consecrate it. Oh, sorry. I skipped a line. That's why. Amar lo natati l'chad sheli shetakti shem l'shamayim. So the son said, I didn't give you my stuff so you could consecrate it. I told you why I gave it to you. I gave it to you just temporarily, right? If you consecrate it, I'll never be able to get it back. Amar lo natata liet shelcha l'shitei atav avicho l'mishotinu muratzim zelizeh. Says, what? You want me to be party to this? You gave it to me so that you and your father can eat at a meal together when you're not supposed to be doing that. And the sin is going to be, now he says it in the third person. He talks about himself in the third person, on his head. What he means to say is the sin is going to be on my head. He's just superstitious, doesn't want to say the sin's going to be on my head. So he says the sin's going to be on his head, his meaning himself. I don't want to be a party to this because then the sin will be on me, that I basically allowed you to go against your vow. And thank you, but no thank you. Amru Chachamim. So what did the rabbis say about this? Kol matana she'ein ima, she'eina she'imikdisha mukudeshet, eina matana. If someone gives a gift, that's only a partial gift, that if the person wanted to consecrate it, they couldn't, that's not a gift. Okay, it doesn't work. So basically, what they're saying is this was never a gift in the first place. Okay, this wasn't a valid gift because it wasn't a gift that the person could do with it whatever they want. And in order for it to be a gift, it has to be something the person could do with it whatever they want. But what does this have to do with our story? It's not exactly the same. But what's similar? Well, in both cases, someone is giving away money to somebody else or giving property for ulterior motives, right? Not really because they want to give it to that person, but because they want to not give their sons inheritance, or they want to create a situation where they can go to a meal with their children. It's interesting. It's kind of the opposite, right? One wants to disconnect with the children. One wants to connect. It's interesting. I didn't think about that till right now. But in any case, there's a big difference between them. And that's why in the end, this isn't comparable. Okay, there's going to be two things we're going to talk about. One is, in the first case, he didn't explicitly say that was why he was doing it. He just did it. Now, it might be implied, but he didn't say it explicitly. In the case of Beit Horon, he said it explicitly. I'm giving this to you just so that I can eat with my father. Okay, Alana Stein-Hain in her book, okay, I'll mention a few things about this. This is interesting. So Alana came out with a book, Circumventing the Law, which I've talked about before. And in the book, she brings up this case. It's a book really trying to discuss when the rabbis allow for circumvention and when they don't, and trying to say that it's not that there's this, you can always circumvent, you can never circumvent. There are ways, but it depends how you do it. And one of the things she talks about here, she actually claims there's a difference, Bava the Yerushalmi, that's her. And that what the problem with the Beit Horon case is it was an obvious ruse. And the rabbis don't like obvious things. Whereas in the other story, it wasn't obvious. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but implied, but no one said it explicitly. Okay? And that's what sort of doesn't, I mean, she doesn't mention our sugya, but she mentions the Beit Horon, and basically claims that it's a shift from the approach of the Yerushalmi. Because in the Yerushalmi, this issue of things being obvious doesn't come up at all. And that the Yerushalmi's concern, right, it's not about being there's too much transparency here about what's going on. That's not the issue. The Yerushalmi focuses more on how conditions impact a gift, and more like condition, and you didn't keep the condition and all that. And anyway, so and since I'm mentioning this, I just want to mention because two of our star teachers are going to be speaking in Jerusalem next week together, which is Alana Steinhain and Ayelet Libson, and specifically about Alana's book in Matan next week. So I don't remember the details, but you can definitely find it. So anyone who lives in Jerusalem or wants to come to Jerusalem to hear them speak, it's a nice opportunity to get to hear from two of our scholars in a different context and meet them in person. Alana's actually here for the year, so it's also an opportunity to find ways to learn from her. Okay, so now we have this case. So the first thing that's similar about them is there's some sort of, ruse going on. Someone's trying to avoid something else. However, there's a difference between one is explicitly stated and one is not, and that in the end is part of the difference about why Yonatan ben Uziel was right. In the end, it's not the same case. But the question is, what's the real comparison? So again, I'm going with the Rashban. The way it works is like this. Both cases have a stipulation, whether implied or not implied, but explicit or not explicitly said. But they had a condition. The money was given with a particular intent in mind. And the one who accepted it went against that intent. So if the one who accepted it goes against the intent, what do we see from the story of Beit Choron? It's not a gift because he consecrated it, which was not the intent of the giver. So because of that, the gift goes back. Okay, the gift is invalid. And that's what Shamai was trying to say. But in the end, right, it's different. And why is it different? Well, what the rabbis are saying in the Beit Choron case, so the reason why Yonatan ben Uziel is right in the end, is because there the gift was problematic from the beginning. Because he wasn't giving the gift in a way that the money could be consecrated. In the story of Yonatan ben Uziel, not only could it have been consecrated, but actually he did consecrate it, and it wasn't a problem, right? So the definition here in Beit Choron is that if it's a gift that can't be consecrated, it's not a gift. It's not if you go against the Tanai, it's that already from the beginning it wasn't a gift. Okay? Because it didn't have the potential to be consecrated, that means he wasn't really giving it. Kind of like I said about Mechirah Chametz, which is different, but you're not really giving it to them to use. Now, theoretically you are, they're just not going to come use it. But if you had given it in a way that you really weren't going to let them into your house to get it if they come, then it wouldn't work. Anyway, I'm not really talking about Mechirah Chametz, but I thought it was an interesting example where we see this, that, in a way that we do it. Okay, so it has to be a real gift, and that's why, and in the end, this is not really a good comparison for the reasons that we said. Again, number one, it wasn't clearly stated at the beginning, and number two, it actually was a valid gift. It's just that he ended up doing something that the giver didn't want, but that's not the same as here, where it was never really given as a valid gift because it never could have been consecrated because the owner didn't allow for it. So it was a limited gift, which means it's not really a gift at all. Okay, now we're going to move on. Staying within Yonatan ben Uziel, but totally off topic. We want to hear who he was. So Tana Rabbanan, the Gemara will tell us some of who he was. And like I said, if you want to learn more about him, you can read Shuli Mishkan's flashback this week. Tana Rabbanan, Shmonim Talmidim Hayulo the Hillel Zakai. Hey, Hillel had 80 students. Shloshim mehem ru'yim shetisha lehem shchinat Moshe Rabbeinu. So 30 of the 80 were of the caliber. That's really high caliber. They're probably exaggerated a little bit, but they were at least people who the Shekhinah could have rested upon them like Moshe Rabbeinu. Shloshim mehem ru'yim shtamod lehem chamak Yoshua ben Nun. 30 of them were on the level that if they wanted to stop the sun like Yoshua did, they could have, right? In other words, they were on a level of Yoshua. Right, we're comparing them to the best of the best. And Esrim Beinoniyin. This is kind of funny line. 20 were in between. Not much in between Moshe and Yoshua, but 20 were in between. You could explain it, although I don't know, but you could explain 20 were, just average students as opposed to being great students. But it doesn't really seem that way from the continuation because they're going to say, Gadol shebekulan Yonatan ben Uziel, Katan shebekulan Rabban Yochanan ben Zakai. So of these 80, it seems like, which would mean they weren't really Benoni average because we're going to see it wasn't average. So probably Benoni means between. The best of the students was Yonatan ben Uziel, and the worst, which is really not very bad, is Rabban Yochanan ben Zakai. And in fact, what they're going to do is they're going to tell us how great the smallest of all the students was. Amru alav Rabban Yochanan ben Zakai. This is what they said about him. Shelo hiniach. He didn't leave. Okay, we're going to see meaning. He didn't leave any of these things aside. All of them he knew. So let's just go through one by one. Mikra, Torah. He knew all of the Torah. Okay, or Tanakh. Mishnah. He knew all the Mishnayot. Now remember, we're in the time period of the Mishnah, so Tanaim. So you have to be careful with the next word. Talmud. Okay, what is Talmud if not, right? Gemara. No, well, it's obviously not Gemara because there was no Gemara. But what it means is understanding the reasons behind the Mishnah, the things that the Gemara does to the Mishnah was going on in that time, just not written down. Halachot. So we're going to go with the Rashbam in these commentaries. Halachot is halacha l'Moshe Sinai. These are traditions that were passed down. Agadot isn't like we think of Agada. Agadot is drashot on the Torah. It's darshaning the Torah to get to halacha, like midrashay halacha. Dikdukei Torah, v'dikdukei sofrim. So dikdukei Torah, they say this is taking something from a verse and saying, oh, this teaches you that. Soflim is all sorts of rabbinic institutions that they did, like siagim, like don't do this because you might come to do that. Okay, those are takanot of the rabbis. Kalim v'chamorim, that's all the kavachomers. Gezerot shavot, he knew all the gezerot shavot. Tkufot, he knew the way the months worked and how to determine the years and the months. Gimatriot, any sort of drashas coming from letters, words, all that. Like not just what we call gematria, but any kind of abbreviations, things like that. Mishalot kofsimu mishalot shoalim. Okay, mishalot shoalim sounds like Aesop's fables, where we take stories of animals and we learn, right? We learn messages from them. Or other mishalot kofsim, those are launderers' parables. Okay, all sorts of parables that people talk about. Now, the Rashbam connects this with Torah because what it's saying is if you use these parables, it will help you understand Torah better. Sichat shedim, now it's getting a little strange. The conversations of the evil spirits, okay, the shedim, the demons. Okay, maybe it means just how to deal with demons. He understood demons. Like if you can understand their conversation, that means you understand them, even if you don't really hear their conversation. Sichat kalim, this is even stranger, right? Well, I don't know. They're both strange. Understanding how the trees talk to each other. Maybe it just means he understood about botany. He understood how trees worked. Sichat malachei sharet, okay, the conversations of angels. The Rashbam says something I didn't understand, which is lehashbiam, okay, to make them take an oath. I'm not sure what that means at all. Okay, but he understood how to deal with angels somehow. And davar gadol v'davar katan, and a big or a little thing. Okay, so now what does it mean davar gadol v'davar katan? As if, okay, the Gemara is going to now explain that. Seems like they understood what everything else meant, even though it wasn't so clear. But they ask, what is davar gadol v'davar katan? Davar gadol ma'aseh merkava. That's in Yechezkel, where he talks about this vision he has of seeing God, which is very hard to understand. We've talked about that before in the Gemara. V'vid davar katan havayot Abai v'Rava. Okay, this is going to make you feel bad a little bit, but the easy stuff is the discussions of Abai and Rava. Okay, first of all, Abai and Rava didn't live in the time of Yochanan and Zakai. He obviously means the types of discussions that we know as Havayot Abai v'Rava, right? That's what they mean here. That's the davar katan, the conversations between the rabbis about things of the Mishnah and the details and the back and forth and the arguing. That's the easy stuff. That's the light stuff. He knew that too. And lekayem mashene'emal, to fulfill the following pasuk. So Rabban Yochanan and Zakai was this, the smallest of all of Hillel's students. He had all this under his belt, and this is a fulfillment of the verse we're going to read right now in Mishlei. Lahanchil ohavai yesh v'otzrotehem amalei. I will give my inheritance to my beloved ones, and I will fill their treasures full of, right? I will fill it up, meaning they're going to be full of Torah. Now, this is a fascinating pasuk to quote here. Why? Because what's it talking about? It's talking about that it's God's inheritance. We've been talking all along about man's and humans' inheritance. And now we're talking about God passing over his nachala. And who does he pass it over to? Those he loves, which is fascinating because what are we discussing here? We're discussing, can you choose one over the other, son among sons? Can you choose to give it not to your sons, to someone you love instead? Now, you could say that this is against what we just talked about. And it's in this Mishnah of, if you give it to someone who's not your son, then you're giving it to, your Em Ruach Chachamim Nochemenu. And maybe it's saying, it's because you can't play God. God can do that if he wants, but you can't. And that's one way of looking at it. I actually think, though, we're all the sons of God. And maybe what they're saying here, or the children of God, I think what they're saying here is that God, and it goes back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka, that you can choose one son over other sons. And that's what God is doing here. God is choosing some children over other children and saying, there's the ones I love, and those are the ones who are going to get my nachala, and you won't get my nachala unless you're in that group. And it's a way to encourage people, right? But it's saying that maybe it's also showing a favoring for Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka. I don't think it's meant to be halachic, but it is a very interesting comparison that you can't help but notice about this issue of God giving nachala to those he loves. It actually sounds also kind of against that pasuk about in the Torah about the one you love or the one you hate, and trying to give the firstborn portion. Again, that's the firstborn portion, not the nachala, but you can't start picking and choosing. So again, it could be differentiating between what God can do and what we can do, and that's, they're different realms. Or it could be saying this is the same kind of idea of bein ben abanim and bat ben abanot. Okay, that you can choose one among many and decide I'm giving more to one than the other, but not take it away entirely, right? This isn't God giving it to some other nation or something like that. Okay, anyway, too interesting to pass up on. Let's continue on though. Now we're back to Yonatan ben Uziel. So we said this was the smallest of all of his students, right? The least important, the least successful. Right? This was the smallest of all of his students. Could you imagine how unbelievable Yonatan ben Uziel is? See, we don't have a lot of information about him, but right, he was amazing. One thing Shuli points out, which is an obvious point, which is Yonatan ben Uziel doesn't appear in the Gemara in general, which is so interesting. If he was this prized student of we do hear from Rabban Yochanan and Zakai, but we don't hear from Yonatan ben Uziel. Now we do have his Targum on the Torah and the Nevi'im, but we don't have his Torah in the Gemara, which is interesting. And while he was learning Torah, any bird that would pass overhead would be burned. Okay, some people, there's a whole slew of explanations, right? Fire doesn't always sound so good, but maybe it's like a Har Sinai type thing. It was like he was learning at Har Sinai where there was fire and it was like God's presence is there. That's one way to look at it. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah. Ha'omer ze b'ni ne'eman, ze achi eino ne'eman. Now we're going to talk about believability, and the whole sugya from here to the end of the daf is going to be all about how we know, on what basis can we believe people. We're going to get back to migos. Since you could have done this, therefore, right, you did something else, we believe you, because if you wanted, you had a simpler way to do it. So if you say, this is my son, we believe you. If you say, this is my brother, we don't believe you. Okay, let's talk about, we're in Dinei Yerusha. So if you say, this is my son, and he's going to inherit, you didn't know I had a son, but you thought I had two sons. Now it turns out I have three, because I told you this is my son, he's going to get a third of the property. Okay, let's just ignore the firstborn issue for this whole discussion, because it just makes it easier. But assuming, right, there's also a firstborn. But anyway, so if you say, this is my son, you're believed, and he's going to get an equal portion with his brothers. If you say ze achi, eino ne'eman. But what if Reuven and Shimon are brothers, and they're supposed to inherit their father's property? And when their father dies, Reuven comes along and says, by the way, there's another brother, Levi. Now, he's not believed. What should happen then? They should split it a third, a third, a third. Again, I'm just putting aside the Bechor issue. Split it a third, a third, a third. Now, if Reuven admits that he has a brother, but Shimon doesn't, so we can't take away lamb from Shimon. And that's why it says, eino ne'eman. So Shimon's going to get his 50%, because if it was just two of them, he'd get 50%. So Shimon gets his 50%. But Reuven, who gets his 50%, has to give some of his 50% to this guy who claims is his brother. So he doesn't have to give more than what he should have. And as he's claiming, I get a third of the property, because Levi should get a third and Shimon should get a third. So we're not taking away anything from Shimon, because he didn't, right? There's no proof that Levi's a brother, and it's only Reuven's word. But by Reuven's own admission, he can lose. So Reuven has to give a sixth of the property, meaning a third of his own property, to his brother. So basically a third, he gets to keep a third, and the remainder of it goes to the brother. Is it a third of his own property? It would be a sixth of the whole property. Okay, so the brother Levi would get a sixth, because he would get half of, right, Reuven's property. Now, right, it would be a half of Reuven's property. No, it wouldn't be a half. It would be a third. Yeah, it would be a third. Okay. Now we get to mate. What if after Reuven gives this portion to Levi, so Levi has the sixth of his father's inheritance, and then Levi dies. Now, when Levi dies, what happens to this portion? He doesn't have sons, assume. Okay, if he doesn't have sons, so who does it go back to? So it goes back to Reuven, because it doesn't go to Shimon. It's not like Shimon would divide the property, because Shimon didn't think it was his brother. Shimon didn't give him any of his portion. So it just reverts back to, that's what it says, so it goes back to Reuven. But now think about it like this. Levi was claimed to be a brother because, right, based on Reuven's testimony. And that's why Reuven had to give some of his portion to Levi. Shimon didn't. And then Levi dies, so that goes back to Reuven, because we don't really have anywhere else to give it. But and Shimon doesn't have any rights to it. But if Levi had other property, not from the inheritance from the father that Reuven gave up some of his for, but Levi has other property, based on Reuven's testimony that Levi is their brother, now, according to Reuven, what's Reuven admitting to here? That all of Levi's property should be divided evenly between me and Shimon. Because if Levi has no brothers and no father to inherit, so Levi's heirs are his brothers. And Reuven admits that Shimon's his brother, and he admits that Levi's his brother, so he admits that Levi should be giving some of his property to Shimon. So Shimon's actually going to get, even though Shimon doesn't have to give him part of his inheritance, Shimon actually is going to win out here and share Levi's inheritance with his brother Reuven. Okay, so that's your Shua Chavimo. And obviously, if there were more brothers, it would be the same. Okay, the whole case about the brother we're going to deal with next class. But today we're going to deal with Zebedina Eman. So Zebedina Eman Lamai Hilchata. What are we learning from Zebedina Eman? What's the relevance of this? Well, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel li Yorsho. Okay, like we said, meaning the son will inherit with the other brothers, even though we didn't know there was another brother. But now the father said, he's my son. He will get inheritance. And liftoret ishtomen yibum. If, let's say, okay, this is a totally different case. There are no brothers. Okay, we're moving now to Amabet. If this son, okay, this person who died or was about to die, claims I have a son. So that means his wife doesn't have to do yibum if he has a son. Now, we don't know that this son is his, but he's believed to say, and that's going to be the whole question, why is he believed in this case? He's believed to say, I have a son to exempt his wife from yibum. And now she won't have to do yibum because there's a son. So the Gemara says first, Liyorsho, Pshita. First they deal with the Yerusha part. It's obvious, Liyorsho, we could do that. He could say someone's his son is going to get inheritance. Let's say, okay, so let's say there was Reuben and Shimon. He says, Levi's my son also. He gets a third of the inheritance. Of course he's believed. If he wanted to, he could have gifted it to him. So since he could have gifted it to him, then therefore, he obviously can also pass it on as inheritance and be believed to say he's my son. So that's obvious. So we don't need a Mishnah to tell us that. To which they answer, the reason why they brought this, and you might say, well, why is it here? But it's here because we're talking about Yerusha. And the real Kiddush here is that he's believed also when it comes to, besides being believed for Yerusha, he's also believed to say, I have a son in terms of the yibum issue. To which the Gemara says, but Hanami Tanina, it's also a Mishnah that taught that. Kiddushin, Mishnah Kiddushin says, Mishamal b'shat mitato yesh li banim ne'eman. If you say when you're about to die, and you say, by the way, I have sons, my wife doesn't have to do yibum, you're believed. Yesh li achim eino ne'eman. If he says, I have brothers, now, this would be a case, now we're going to talk about it in a minute, that the Gemara there explained, that the case is where we don't know that this person has brothers and we don't know he has any sons. Now, if he has no brothers, there's no yibum. Yibum is only if you have brothers. If you don't have brothers, she's not chayiv in yibum. So she's already, based on chazaka, presumptive status, she doesn't have to do yibum. So therefore, if the husband says, I have a son, he's believed because anyway, she was exempt from yibum. So he's just substantiating that claim, and that if somehow they were to find he had a brother, we now believe him because he was believed already to say he had a son. So if later in time they find he had a brother, then right, he's believed to say, I have a son. We believe him now because she has anyway a presumptive status of being exempt. But he can't say, I have brothers and be believed, because I have brothers would change the presumptive status. Right now, we assume he doesn't have brothers, and we don't know anything about the children, right? We assume he doesn't have children. But if he says, I have a brother, and there's no obvious children around, then she would have to do yibum. So we don't believe the husband to obligate a woman who's not obligating yibum right now to be obligated based on his word alone. So now the Gemara says, so that already teaches you these beliefs to have a son in terms of the yibum issue. To which the Gemara says, no, hatam de lo muchzak lam ba'ach. Hacha af agav de muchzak lam ba'ach. Our Mishnah is adding something new, because that Mishnah, as I said, was a case where there was a chazaka that there was no brothers. There was presumptive status. Nobody knew of any brothers. So that's why he's believed to say also, oh, and by the way, I have a son, because anyway, she was going to be exempt. But in our case, what's our Mishnah teaching you? Even more than that. Even if he has a presumptive status that we know he has brothers, we believe the father to say he has a son and exempt his wife from yibum. That's the chidush here. Our Mishnah is going one step farther. So now we have to figure out, why is he believed? So Amar Rav Yosef, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, we're going to have a situation where Rav Yosef quotes Rav Yehuda, who quoted Shmuel. Then Rav Yosef's going to say, this doesn't make so much sense, what I'm quoting. Okay, maybe he thought like, you remember in his old age, he kind of starts forgetting things. So then he starts analyzing it. He says, must be Shmuel said something else. And then he develops how he got to what he said. Okay, so we'll see. Amar of Yosef, Amar of Yudam, Shmuel. So he passes this down. He says the following: why do we say the son is believed, even if there's a presumptive status that she should have to do yibum? He's believed to have a son. Well, it's amigo again. Ho'il is like amigo. Ho'il means since. Since the husband could be believed if he says, I divorced my wife. He's sitting on his deathbed. He says, listen, you guys don't know, but in secret, I divorced my wife. We believe him, even if there's no evidence, to exempt her from yibum. So if he wanted to, he could have just said that. So why would he bother saying, this guy's my son? It must be that we believe him because he could have just said, I divorced my wife. And that would have exempted her from yibum. And therefore we believe him, he has a son to exempt her from yibum. But Amar of Yosef, married to Avraham, it's like a way of saying, what? Tale Tanya, but Delo Tanya. Can't be that that's what he said, because he's depending this drasha of his on something that was never stated in a Mishnah or a Braita. In other words, he's saying, since it's so obvious that a man could say, I divorced my wife, he'd be believed, therefore he's believed to say, I have a son. So he's depending our Mishnah, the logic of our Mishnah, on some other, not Mishnah, not Braita. In other words, no, we don't know. We don't have a Mishnah or Braita that says a husband's believed to say his wife is divorced. Okay, like I got me, but who's got you, right? So, right, where do we know that from? So then he changes what he must have heard from Rabbi Yehuda, who said in the name of Shmuel. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel mipnei ma amru ze b'ni ne'eman ho'ilu biyado legarsha. This is a different ho'il, a different migo, because he could divorce her right now. If he wanted to, he could make a divorce right now. It's not the easiest thing to just get divorced in a minute, but he could theoretically. It's in his control to divorce her. So if he really wants to exempt her from yibum, and he doesn't have a son, he could resolve it by divorcing her. And then she'll be divorced and she won't have to do yibum. Therefore, he's believed to say, I have a son to exempt her from yibum. And then comes Rav Yosef and he says, Amar Rav Yosef, Hashdida Amrat Amrinan Hoel. Now he's going to say, how did we get to this statement that I quoted before, that the husband's believed to say the wife I divorced my wife? Well, Hashdida Amrat Amrinan Hoel, since you could say Hoel biyado legarsha, and therefore he's believed to have a son, Baal Shamar Gerashti Dishineman. You can be believed to say you divorced your wife because because if you didn't really do it, you could do it right now. Since it's something in your control, we assume that if you say you did it, you must have really done it. Otherwise, if it wasn't done, you would just do it right now. So you must be believed. So now we ended up with two ho'ils, right? Ho'il biyado legarsha. Since he can divorce her, we've now learned two things. Since he can divorce her, he's believed to say, I divorced my wife. And since he's believed to divorce her, since he could divorce her, he's believed to say, I have a son. Because both those things exempt him from yibum. And then theoretically, you go back to the original statement and say, well, since he's believed to say he divorced his wife, therefore we believe him to say he has a son. But you can also say it more simply, since he can divorce her right now. Okay, now we're going to deal with this thing. Is the husband really believed to say he divorced his wife? We're going to see different opinions about it. Ki ata Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef came from Israel to Babylonia. He told us in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Baal Shamar gerashti tishti eino ne'eman. He says, he's not believed to say, I divorced my wife. Minapech Rav Sheshet biyadeh. When Rav Sheshet heard this, he goes like this with his hands, like, Azalei ho'il to Rav Yosef. And he goes to Rav Yosef like, poo-poo to you. He says, the ho'il of Rav Yosef just blew up into thin air, right? That it's gone. Because your whole ho'il was based on, since he can divorce her, he can say, I divorce, right? Since it's biyado to divorce her, he could say, I divorced her. He could say, I have a son. But you see here that Rabbi Yochanan said you can't. So there goes his ho'il. Okay, but it's not over yet. The Gemara says, really? That's what Rabbi Yochanan said? Someone else came and brought the Torah of Rabbi Yochanan and said, says that Rabbi Yochanan said the exact opposite. A husband who said he divorced his wife is believed. How do we reconcile those two opposing opinions of what Rabbi Yochanan said? To which the Gemara says, Lo kashya. Kan lemafreya, kan lahaba. This is a very interesting issue. Why is a husband believed to say, I divorced my wife? Because he could do it right now if he wanted. That means the husband is believed to say, I divorced my wife now. He's not believed to say, I divorced her 2 months ago. Now, why would he want to say, I divorced her 2 months ago? Let's say she slept with some other man a month ago, and she's supposed to get the death penalty. So he wants to protect her because even though she cheated on him, right, he doesn't want her to get killed. So he claims that he divorced her 2 months ago. That obviously he's not believed because it's not biyado. It's not in his hands to divorce her 2 months ago. It was at the time, but it's not right now. When he's standing today and says, I divorced my wife 2 months ago, he's not believed because he can't divorce her right now 2 months ago. It's not possible. So that's the differentiation between what Rabbi Yochanan said. Rabbi Yochanan said he's not believed. It's to say what happened 2 months ago. He is believed to say from now, starting from here, she's divorced. And that means if she wants to get married, she can go get married to anybody else based on his testimony. It means or the truth is, I wonder if we go that far, we would allow that actually. But what it does mean is she wouldn't have to do yibum. Okay, if he's to die, 5 minutes later. It means she was divorced from then, and therefore she won't have to do yibum. So now the Gemara asks a good question. And then we're going to get into something called pagina dibure, which we've seen a bunch of times, which is we take someone's testimony, can we split it in two and say we believe this, we don't believe that. So amar lemafreya mahu lehimune lahaba. If he says I divorced her 2 months ago, and then he drops dead and he has no children. Now, we don't believe him that he divorced her 2 months ago because we just said he's not believed. But can we believe him that from now she's divorced and she doesn't have to do yibum? So mi pagina dibure or lo pagina dibure. So we believe the fact that he says she's divorced from now, but we don't believe that she was divorced 2 months ago. So if she slept with some other man, she's not going to be exempt from the death penalty. But, right, from before. But if she sleeps with someone tomorrow, she won't get the death penalty. Okay? So that's a question. Rav Mari, Rav Tzvi, Chadamar Pagina, Chadamar Lo Pagina. So one said, yes, we split it. And actually, she's considered divorced from now because he could have divorced her right now. And the other one says, no, because we don't accept that she was divorced from 2 months ago. So then we cancel what he said. We don't accept him at all. We don't believe. There's no believability here. So we cancel the whole thing. To which the Gemara says, wait, someone says Lo Pagina, but how does that work in with this? We know that there's a concept of Pagina. And we know that no one disagrees with Rava on this issue because my shnami de Rava, da Amar Rava, ish ploni ba'al ishti. What if somebody says, someone slept with my wife? Huva achir mitztarfin lahorgo. Lahorgo velo lahorga. Now, this is a fascinating case. He said, so-and-so slept with my wife. Now, a man is not believed to testify against his wife because he's a relative of hers. But he is believed about the person who slept with her. The person who slept with her, he basically said, slept with a married woman. So we accept that testimony. And even though we know it's with his wife, it's not like any random woman because maybe she wasn't a married woman. Then he wouldn't get the death penalty. But to give someone the death penalty, we believe him that this person slept with a married woman. But we don't believe his testimony about his wife. Lahorgo, he can kill him based on the testimony as long as he's with some other witness, right? One witness doesn't do anything. But if he's with somebody else, that's huva acher, he and someone else, mitzdarfim can be testifying together against this man, but not against her. So we accept half of what he said, not the whole thing. Okay? To which no one disagrees. So how could you say someone says here lo pagina dibure and we don't accept it, right? Not even lahaba for the divorce. To which the answer is a differentiation between the cases. Betray gufe paginan, b'cha gufa lo paginan. In the case of the man and this man slept with my wife, there's two different people here. There's a testimony about the man and there's testimony about the woman. Even though they're intertwined, there's two different people here. Okay, some people even say two different actions. He had relations with her. She, was passive in it. That's some, in the halachic, it's that she was niv'ala and he was the bo'el. But you don't even have to say that because you could just say there's testimony about two different people. Whereas the other one is he's testifying about his wife, that she's divorced from him. That's one goof. That's one incident, one action, and one person. So that you could say maybe lo pagina. Okay, and that's where we end for today. So we'll do a quick review of our daf. We started with this Maaseh Adam, this weird case where he tried to write his sons out of the will, gave it to Yonatan ben Uziel. Yonatan ben Uziel gave the kids some of the money back, and Shamai got very angry at him, but in the end, Yonatan ben Uziel was right. We tried to figure out what was Shamai thinking. We went through the story of Beit Horon to use it as proof, But in the end, we differentiated between the cases, even though the Gemara didn't do all that work. But we went with the Rashbam and how the Rashbam explained what Shamai thought and what Yonatan ben Uziel, why these cases were not a fair comparison. Then we talked about how great Yonatan ben Uziel was, really by comparing how great the worst of the students of Hillel was, which was Rabban Yochanan and Zakai, as opposed to, Yonatan ben Uziel was actually the greatest of them. And we did say one thing about him, how every time he would learn, any bird that would pass overhead would be burned because it was so hot, the fire, of his learning of Torah. Then we'd start talking about believability. And we really focus more on this case. We'll get back to the brother tomorrow. But if you say Ze b'ni, you're believed. This is my son, you'll be believed. And the question was, that was for both Yerusha and for yibum purposes, to exempt his wife from yibum. And the whole thing was premised on that if he wanted to, he could divorce his wife right then, and she would be exempt. And that's why he's believed, even if there's an assumption he has brothers and she would have been obligated, not like in Kiddushin where it was less obvious that she was already exempt from yibum. Even if she was chayav in yibum, we still believe him to have a son and exempt her because he's believed to basically, number one, divorce her right then and there if he wanted. And on that account, he's also believed to say, I already divorced my wife. But that would only be effective from now, right? And that was based on this resolution to the contradiction between Rabban Yochanan, who said he is or not believed about saying, I divorced my wife. And that's because retroactively it doesn't work because he can't retroactively do a divorce now, but he is believed going forward. And then we just had the whole question, what about Pagina Dibure? If he says she was divorced from then, do we at least allow it to kick him from now? And on that, there was a machloket. With that, we finish for today, wishing everyone a good day, and we should have good news, which is something we need these days more than ever.